lower extremity. So let's get back to talking about how it all works together. And specifically, we left off talking about das Foot. So why do we care about the foot in the first place? Actually, hold on. I think I've advanced this way further than I should have. Bingo. All right, sorry. Talking about the knee. So I can see the chat, and of course, you're going to be not too helpful. All righty then. Okay. So my chat's not coming up correctly because reasons. Just a heads up in case you leave a comment, it's best to just unmute yourself and go and ask it, guys. But the nice thing with our patella is it's actually going to improve the mechanical advantage. And it does so by effectively, if we've got our knee joint, we have the patella sitting on top, we create a greater angle here to pull from, as opposed to the patella wasn't here, it would go straight down, and we wouldn't have nearly as great a leverage when we're trying to extend the knee. Now, inside the knee, we have what's known as our meniscus. And I'm sure a number of you guys have an unfortunate understanding of it because you've maybe torn it or damaged your meniscus before. And the meniscus, as you guys can see, are going to effectively be two major essential shock absorbers for the knee. It's just connective tissue that specifically is flattened out. Unfortunately, if you guys look at that lateral meniscus, you can see how between our ACL, anterior collateral limit or cruciate ligament, pardon me, and our PCL, our posterior cruciate ligament, you can see how that anterior ligament is pretty close to being attached to the menisci. So hence, if you tear your ACL, sometimes you're also going to tear your meniscus. Now, these are useful because it's going to increase the surface area that you're going to be able to distribute the force that's going to occur whenever you happen to be, obviously, performing different activities. Now, the types of tears you're going to have is a vertical tear, you can have a radial tear, and then, unfortunately, in the example of the displaced bucket, this is where you're going to have the knee kind of catch sometimes in position because it's not going to move. And the knee also has a number of bursa, just like the hips, that are going to work effectively as the fluid-filled small sacs that are going to effectively be pads for the knee, and specifically between the patella, the femur, and the tibia, and some of the connective tissues. So that way, it's going to be a little more comfortable to use those. So now, the collateral ligaments are going to be the ligaments that are on the outside. So we have our MCL and our LCL. And then there's even a slight variation on the LCL that some folks have. But then we have our cruciate ligaments, and those are going to be inside, and they're going to be the ones that are crossing over each other. And they're going to be what's connecting both the anterior and the posterior segments of the knees. And since they obviously twist over one another, as we going and rotating, we're going to cause that to twist even more as we might be letting our knee essentially turn inwards, especially under heavy loads or high speeds. Now, you have a very small muscle in the back of the knee, what's known as the popliteus, and this is going to effectively start with unlocking the knee and allowing it to do a little bit of lateral rotation whenever we're going and trying to flex the knee. So full extend is our leg straight, flexing is allowing that knee to go ahead and turn so that we're pulling our heel into our butt. And we have a number of muscles that are going to do so. The major ones are going to be our hamstrings. Now, this is going to have a little bit of help through our gracilis, sartorius, popliteus, and our gastrocnemius. Now, of those options, your gastroc is actually probably the strongest of all the knee flexors, which is also a plantar flexor. The gracilis, sartorius, and popliteus are also going to work as adductors. So, what's interesting when you're looking at your knee flexors, and we're talking about both the long head of the biceps femoris and then what's known as our semitendinous and semimembranous muscles, we're going to have a greater amount of force, not just allowing us to flex the knee, but extend the hip. So that's why the hamstrings are so important in movements like sprinting, and especially when we're trying to de-accelerate the leg when the leg's coming through, meaning we're bringing our leg back in front of us so we can hit the ground and push again. And that's why people who are trying to stop really aggressively have a greater risk of actually tearing their hamstrings. Now, the gastroc, which is going to be one of the two major plantar flexors, right underneath it is going to be our soleus, and that's going to only work as a plantar flexor. The gastroc, you can see how by its origin being in the posterior of the femur, right off of effectively your condyles, yes, you're going to be able to produce both plantar flexion, so pushing yourself up on your toes, and then knee flexion. Now you can see the popliteus, remember that's just gonna be what's gonna unhook, but it'll also allow a little bit of that rotation at the knee joint. And what's really fascinating is the key differences between your gastroc and your soleus. The gastroc is actually typically has a greater amount of type 2 muscle fiber. So it's more of an anaerobic power muscle, whereas your soleus instead is much more type 1, and it's more about aerobic performance. And so you can actually look at somebody's calf development and get a bit of an idea of what type of training they typically are going to be performing, since obviously the muscles of the body are going to start to take on characteristics and adapt obviously to the demands that are being placed upon it. So our knee extensors, so it's gonna be straightening that leg. We've got one that's two joints, and that's the rectus femoris. So it's gonna both work as a hip flexor, so lifting our leg up straight in front of us, and a knee extensor. Now, the ones that are just going to be causing our knee to extend is going to be our vastus medialis, and that's going to be the teardrop on the inside of the thigh, the vastus lateralis, which is going to be on the outside of the thigh, and the intermedius, which is directly underneath your rectus femoris, so you never really get a good look at it just because of the way your muscles are essentially laying on top of one another. Now we get down to our ankle, which is going to be what's known as the tibio-talar joint. Now this is a hinge where we've got the convex surface of the talus itself, and it's going to have the concave part of the tibia moving on top of it. This is the ankle joint. Now, you then have what's known as the distal tibiofibular joint, and that's going to be where the fibula is going to be together with the tibia through a very dense amount of fibrous tissue. So this is connective tissue that's going to keep these two together. So altogether, it gives us this structure of the ankle, where you can see where we have our fibula, our tibia, our talus, and then directly underneath it, our calcaneus. Now, our ankles are going to give us dorsiflexion. So that's going to be lifting our toe up towards the ceiling, and that's going to be mostly being performed by our tibialis anterior. Now, notice we have our extensor digitorum longus, peroneus tertius, hallucis, extensor hallucis longus, and a few other small extensor muscles that are going to cross over and allow us to lift. Now, this is a pairing of muscles that you typically have a pretty big discrepancy. I think usually you can see working about a 4-to-1 ratio of however much weight you can calf raise, you can maybe lift a quarter of that on the end of your foot. Now, when it comes to plantar flexion, it's going to make perfect sense because look at the size of your soleus and your gastroc. Now, your gastroc is the more superficial, but aside from just the gastroc and soleus, you're going to have our tibialis posterior, plantaris, peroneus longus, flexor hallucis longus, peroneus brevis, and flexor digitorum longus that are going across. So literally the muscles that are going to help us grab the floor with our feet, they're also going to allow us to plantar flex, pushing ourselves up onto our toes. Now, right underneath our talus, we have what's known as the subtalar joint. And this is going to be where the talus itself is going to effectively be articulating with our calcaneus. Now, this is where we're going to get eversion and inversion and eversion whenever we're looking at the movement of the ankle. So think of it along the lines of pronation and supination. So when we pronate, we're everting. So that's when we're turning out to the sides. When we're trying to lift our foot up towards the midline, that is going to be inversion. Now, this is a natural occurrence. So when you lift your foot up, you're going to feel how your foot is going to start to go a little bit into effective eversion. And then when we push down, we're going to go ahead and see that inversion through plantar flexion. So by looking at someone's ankles, their feet, how they're interacting, you can start to see folks that have overpronation, and this is going to be typically where you're going to have a excessive amount of internal or of external rotation, which is going to cause the collapsing of your arches. Whereas with supination, you're going to see a super high arch, and that's going to be where we're turning on in. Now, from there, we have our tarsal, metatarsal, and intermetatarsal joints. Altogether, the foot has about, I believe it's 36 bones in it. And it has about, 24 bones in it and about 36 different joints. Your feet can move in a variety of ways. The key is most of our feet, meaning, you guys listening and most of the people you meet, because we spend our entire lives wearing shoes, our feet are incredibly weak and they're not capable of doing all of the actions that they would have been able to do had it not been for obviously wearing shoes for nearly all of your life. Now, this allows for a lot of gliding movements, and this is going to allow our foot to be both semi-rigid and then allowing it to move in a lot of different angles whenever we happen to need it to adapt to those positions. And unfortunately, wearing shoes for long enough, and specifically shoes that come to a point, we're going to see perturbations in the way that our bones and joints should happen. It'd be the equivalent of if the only thing you were allowed to wear for your entire life was boxing gloves, and you'd wonder why you're not able to have a lot of dexterity with your hands and wrists, because all you can effectively do is this and this, that's it. You're not able to actually do much more. So the metatarsal, phalangeal, and interphalangeal joints, those are going to effectively be condyloid and hinge joints, and that's going to be where we're really talking about our toes. Now, these are really important because they're going to allow us to control our weight shift and allow us to have a greater amount of stability whenever we happen to be doing any type of movement where we're obviously walking across the ground. And they're going to give us a greater amount of contact surface that we're going to be able to gain traction from and move. Now, directly behind them, we have what's known as our arches. Now, the medial and lateral longitudinal arches stretch from all the way at the base of our foot, the calcaneus, to those metatarsals and tarsals. Now, this is going to be formed by essentially those metatarsal bones, and that arch is going to allow for a little bit of essentially receiving and returning elastic energy. So I'm sure all of you guys have heard of plantar fascia before. And this is that really thick band of connective tissue that's going from that calcaneus all the way to our metatarsal joints. And this is effectively going to allow for a stretch and return of energy, which is going to make us literally more efficient while we happen to be moving. Now, how many of you guys in here have ever had plantar fasciitis? Nobody's ever had any issues with plantar fasciitis, foot pain or otherwise? Well, good for you guys. So did it feel like every time you were moving, there was like a knife turning in the bottom of your foot, like probably the most when you first got up in the morning? Yeah. So what did you guys do that effectively caused that to occur? Jesus, that's intense, Catherine. Bingo. And it's not just running, but it's running in such a way that we're effectively having too great of impact and force going through our foot for our body to effectively be able to remodel and tolerate. So if you're having those issues, you look at your shoes, you look at, did you really increase your volume, and making sure that you kind of work your way back so that you're allowing those tissues to recover like they should. Luke, what caused yours? Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you're no longer wearing shoes. I mean, think about it, guys. We are soft. Like, we're incredibly soft. Like, how many of you guys, if you had to walk across campus barefoot right now, would be, you'd have a lot of trepidation about doing it, not just because of the temperature outside, but because your feet aren't even used to it. I mean, dear God, not to get too much on a soapbox, but it terrifies me that so many people enjoy getting pedicures. It's like, hey, a little bit of callus and actual, like, strength that you have in the bottom of your foot to deal with the work of daily living. Let's remove that and make sure that your feet are hobbled so you can't actually, fight and run away. But then again, that kind of is the crux of a lot of women's fashion, isn't it? Making it so you're not able to defend yourself and run as quickly as you'd like. Huh, I never really thought about that like that. I mean, you ever seen anybody try to sprint in tall heels? How well does that typically work out? And actually, while we're at it, this is an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to not just foot health, but then just overall lower extremity health. Pretty much every shoe you're wearing has a little bit of a greater amount of pad in the heel than it has in the forefoot. So it naturally gives you a little bit more height, a little bit more elevation. Now, think biomechanically, guys. If all you ever wore were like, we'll say like tall heels, I'm sorry, ladies, it's been a long time since I've dressed in drag, so I haven't worn heels for going on over a decade now. About what would be like a tall heel these days? Like, what's a tall heel? Yeah, that sounds pretty damn tall. Okay, so if you're wearing a 6-inch heel, okay, and let's say you're somebody that's kind of a masochist and they're wearing heels all the time, what do you think is going to happen adaptively to your body from wearing heels all the time? What do you guys think is going to happen to the lower extremity if you're wearing heels all the time? Yeah, because you're shifting your weight forwards, you're putting a little bit more force on your knee. Absolutely. Absolutely. What else potentially? Yeah, pressure focused to a smaller area in the forefront of the foot. So you're talking about, issues with blistering, bones having to remodel to be scrunched in. Because I don't see a lot of like wide toe box heels. But then again, I don't really look at people's feet much when they're wearing heels, much less do I see that many students walking around campus in heels. And Lord knows I don't go out to the places where people typically would, social pressure would be there for them to wear heels. Mm-hmm. Okay, so aside from issues with the feet, think about the muscles and the tendons. What do you think is going to happen? In what way, Roland, when we say stress on those muscles? And which muscles at that? Are they actually stretching, Catherine? You might have a tightening of the arches because you're naturally in a tighter position. That's quite possible. What do you guys think are going to happen to the muscles of the calf if you're constantly wearing heels all the time? Not really. you're not really going to get strong calves from wearing heels. Instead, think of it along the lines if you effectively could never fully extend your hips. You had to always have your hips bent forward. What do you think is going to happen to the length of the muscles of your hip flexors if you're constantly having to be bent over all day? They'll shorten. You'll get tighter. So your muscles of your plantar flexion, specifically your gastroc and your soleus, they're going to literally shorten. Yeah. You're going to have tighter muscles of the calf because of the fact that they're constantly in a shortened position. So if we've got calves that are naturally very tight and they're not able to move through as many degrees of range of motion, how do you think that's going to influence things like your squat patterns? How do you think it's going to influence things like your lunges if you're not able to move through a full range of motion at the ankle? Does that make sense to you guys? Look at us. Biomechanically, we've shown now why you shouldn't wear heels. So when it comes to our toe flexion and extension, there's a lot of muscles that are going to be effectively working towards it. Don't worry about memorizing what's all involved in flexion extension. What I want you guys to have more is an appreciation for the number of different muscles that are running through both the top and the underside of your foot that are all important for force production, along with that very thick fascial band, where we're going to have a lot of those different effects through or movements through the feet that are going to occur thanks to effectively the development of those muscles. And unfortunately, once again, a lot of us, because we spend so much time wearing shoes and because we don't really do much to strengthen our feet, we can definitely have some issues. Now, we then remember again, guys, we've got that inversion and eversion of which of those muscles that are going to be helping with allowing that to occur, of our tibialis anterior and posterior, and then our peroneus longus, brevis, and tertius that are all going to allow for that to happen. So there's a number of different misalignments you can have of the lower extremity. The first one that we'll talk about is what's known as either varus, neutral, or valgus of the knee. So wherever you guys are at, just go ahead and stand up. And I want you to stand up and I want you to put your feet together. Now, if you have normal knees, they should effectively be, pretty close to each other, but they shouldn't be touching. If you've got a high degree of knee valgus, that's where literally the bones, your femur and tibias on both sides will actually be touching one another. And this is sometimes referred to as kind of knock knee. And then we've got varus. That's gonna be where your knees, there's almost a gap between them whenever those feet are together. And that's sometimes referred to as bow-legged. Now, what do you think is going to occur whenever we load up the leg, whenever we've got a great degree of valgus or a great degree of varus, and it comes to, running, lifting, etc.? What do you think are some of the outcomes that are going to occur? Potentially. There's definitely going to be a greater amount of stress on one side than the other. What else? Be right back, folks. I'm just going to go check on one thing in the lab, but I want to see some comments. I mean, your knee or legs could break under high weight irregardless of this formation. But think about the uneven forces that are also going to be going through the meniscus, guys. Someone that's got knee valgus, they're effectively going to have a greater amount of, interior knee pain, specifically. Well, you can tear things if you go heavy enough, Stuff happens when you party hard, Catherine. It's just the way life goes. But look at the uneven wear you can see between the actual meniscus of the knee. You can see how there's literally a greater compression on one side and tension on the other. So we're talking about stretching out one ligament while we're essentially shortening the other. And adaptively over long enough periods of time, you can obviously have some health issues of where effectively you're going to be able to not move through the same ranges of motion that you would, hopefully be able to move thanks to, well, not so much move through ranges of motion, but just that uneven wear, just like uneven wear on your tires. So if you're constantly doing uneven wear on your tires, they don't last as long. And it turns out it's a lot easier to replace tires than it is a knee. Now, there's also what's known as femoral anteversion, and this is going to be literally the angle of which your femoral neck and head is going into your hip. And this in turn is going to cause internal or external rotation. This one specifically is going to cause internal rotation of the hip. In fact, one of the girls currently on the cheerleading squad has got pretty obvious anteversion where literally like her knees, her actual like patellas are nearly touching each other when her feet are relatively straightforward. Now, the opposite can occur where we have retroversion. So that's going to cause that foot to be angled, or that knee to be angled out. Along with, we can have changes in literally the angle of the femur itself. So normal, notice it's a pretty decent range from 120 to 135 degrees. Coxa Vera is where we've got 120, and Coxa Valga is when we've got 135 and greater. Now, in Coxa Valga compared to Coxa Vera, who do you think is going to have a natural advantage when they're trying to learn how to do something like the splits? Bingo. Because think about it, as your hips are going out to the side, the person with the Coxa Vera has almost got a hard angle, so they can literally just run into their hip bone a lot earlier. But the person with the Coxa Valga can go through a large range of motion before they're ever going to have an issue with effectively bone being on bone. Now, at the same time, the Coxa Vera, due to having that wider angle, is probably also going to have a predisposition for greater force production. So what you lose in mobility, you can potentially gain in strength. And it's important to understand that literally we're going to have slight variations on how our pelvises are oriented, how our femurs are oriented, how our tibias are oriented, which can give us, advantages and disadvantages depending on what physical endeavor you choose to go into. Now, how many of you guys have heard about what's known as the Q angle? How many of you guys have heard of the Q angle? Anyone heard of the Q angle? Okay. So the Q angle is exactly that. So how steep of an angle you're going to have from essentially from the femur to the tibia. And so in general, women have broader hips relative to their height than men. So those broader hips in turn is going to create a greater Q angle, which notice, guys, is going to give a greater acute angle at the knee. So in theory, it's going to be harder on the knees of a female who happens to be doing things like long distance running as opposed to a male. Now, notice this is in theory. When we get down, to real life, there's obviously a huge variation on the bone structure between, not just between the genders, but within the genders. Now, when you think about people that are successful, like they win, they're good long distance runners, do any of them have really broad hips? Do any of them really tend to have really broad hips? And why do you think that would be, Luke? No worries. Catherine, have you ever seen a long distance runner who wins, who's really good, who's got really broad hips? A, it's less efficient because you've got a broader body, so you've got greater drag. We haven't really talked about drag yet. But it's just the simple reality is that broader hip is going to cause you to have to create greater amounts of forces to keep yourself in through the midline, along with your encountering greater forces through the knees, which is potentially going to be much harder for you to obviously tolerate over long periods of time, thanks to that differing Q angle between having narrower and broader hips. That's why typically your cross-country athletes have, relatively narrow bone structures, because there's actually not just more efficient, but they also are going to be much more comfortable. Go figure. Now, the antithesis is going to be true when it comes to a lot of power production, specifically when you look at rotational power. And that's when you look at a lot of people like football players, shot putters, throwers. You're going to normally see broader frames, not just shoulders, but also the hips, because it's going to allow you to create a greater amount of rotational power. Because think back to when we talked about the wonders of rotation. If we have a greater axis to rotate from, we're going to, in turn, be able to create a greater amount of torque. Does that make sense to you guys? Awesome. So, with those femurs and that internal rotation, you're going to go ahead and have some differences in how those bones in the lower extremity are going to work. This is why some folks are going to have they really have to turn their feet out a lot to get into a squat, and not because of issues with mobility at the ankle, but simply because they can have femoral or tibial torsion where they have natural rotation occurring. So their bones literally don't line up. And as you'd suspect, over long enough periods of time with asymmetric loading through the lower body, you can effectively start to have portions of your joints effectively that are breaking down faster than they should. Now, with chondromalacia, we're really talking about issues with the pad of the underside of the patella, with the femur and the tibia, where you can really just have some inflammation for, effectively the amount of force that's being produced in those areas and how quick or how frequently it's being applied. But like anything else, the body is always going to have a certain amount of adaptability. So what questions do you guys have for me through the lower extremity? Interesting, Luke. So that's probably of the, when you say pain in your feet and your toes, is that probably because you're probably applying too much of a stretch on those tissues than what you're used to? So if anything, you could be really talking about not just calf stretching, but toe stretching. Because if you've got a lot of tightness in those muscles that all go through the bottom of your feet for the flexors, digitorum longus brevis, hallucis longus brevis flexors, that could be putting a really hard stretch on them from what they're used to. So really just trying to literally stretch them out and not just only putting them in that end range hard stretch, which is also gonna be dynamic as you're doing something like a push-up. Possibly. But I mean, it's not so much that you did push-ups once per day or otherwise it's the issue. Keep in mind, guys, when it comes to mobility of any of your joints, it's an aspect of how frequently you're applying the stretch. So if you're only stretching, you're doing push-ups for, statistically, we're going to say it's 10 minutes of the day. Well, we're talking about 1/6 of an hour. Or if you're going to talk about, now we've got 24 hours in the day. So now you're talking about 24 plus 12. So you've got 100 or 144th of the day you're actually stretching it. The rest of it, it's in an unstretched position or even in a tightening position. So if you really want to try to elongate tissues, it requires concerted effort. And it's nothing that you're going to do, rapidly. It's something you're going to have to work your way up into. So, good question, Luke. Any other questions you guys want me to go and touch on before we start getting into bone growth and development? Or is it more of me talking to myself? So, let's start off first by just talking about effective, structure of bone. So first and foremost, we have to understand what is stiffness, okay? Stiffness is effectively the stress divided by the strain in a load material. So this is going to be the amount of force you're going to need to produce in order to change its shape. And then it also is going to have compressive strength. So literally how much force you have to use in order to compress, to somehow shorten those bones. And so bones themselves are going to have both stiffness and compressive strength. And this is going to be mostly due to the mineral composition of bones. Calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate. Now, obviously, there's also protein structures holding all that together, along with, we're going to use minerals like strontium when it comes to tendon into bone interfacing. So now, depending on how we're producing force or putting force upon a bone, it's going to affect how much it can tolerate before it breaks. So true compression is the force of which our bones are most well adapted to tolerating. Tension, so pulling the bone apart, isn't near as much, but the one that's the weakest is shearing force. And that's going to be that rotating about an axis or pushing and pulling on one side at the same time. So that's why it's pretty rare that someone is going to break a bone from just straight loading, but when they take a hard hit from an angle, it doesn't require as much force. And then if you guys want to look at reasons why you probably shouldn't get in an arm wrestling, look at videos of people where they go through and get a spiral fracture of the upper arm when doing when arm wrestling. It looks horrible. So the flexibility component is going to be coming from what's collagen. And as you get to be older and older, you tend to lose some of the collagen in your bones, and they can become effectively a bit more brittle. Now, bone strength itself is going to be not just made up of minerals, but water is going to comprise a decent amount of it, along with they're going to naturally have pores. So effectively, the porosity, the amount of the bone volume that's filled with pores and cavities, is going to depend on how much loading that has occurred. Your bones are constantly trying to go ahead and remodel based upon the demands you're placing them through. And those demands are being placed effectively because of the forces your muscles are producing or requiring your bones to receive. So if typically your highest bone mineral densities you're going to find on athletes are your true contact combat athletes. So your football players are going to typically have higher bone mineral densities than your long distance runners, regardless of nutritional issues with long distance runners. And they're going to have denser bones than your swimmers. Now, we have, based upon how much porousness you have, two different types of bones. We have our cortical bone, which is going to be the low porosity, which is going to be essentially along the shaft in the center of the bone. And then we have our trabecular bone, which is going to be more porous. And this is the end of our long bones. And this is where we're going to see a lot of that remodeling to deal with the forces that are being produced. Now, you can see in the picture what's known as the epithelial plate. These are going to be those growth plates. And that's where effectively your bones are getting longer from. At one point, they're going to fuse, and that's going to be as long as you're going to go ahead and, or as long as that bone is going to go ahead and get. And so that cortical bone can deal with a greater amount of stress, but can't deal with as much strain. Whereas the trabecular bone, since it's spongier, it can go through a bit more strain, but it's not going to be able to deal with as great of amount of stress. So that's why it's usually different causes for why you break your bones in the trabecular or at the cortical. So we then have what's known as our axial skeleton, and this is going to be everything through the midline. So our head, our neck, our rib cage, and then our lumbar spine into our sacrum. Our appendicular is everything else. So this is all the bones related to our arms and all the bones related to our legs. Now, within that, we have classifications of bones. First up, we have our short bones. Pretty straightforward. This is going to be our carpals, our tarsals, okay? We then have our flat bones, and these are going to be ones that are obviously larger and flatter, important for muscular attachments along with protection. So we're talking about our ribs, our scapula, our sternum, our patella, and then some of the bones of the skull. You then have the irregular bones, where they're really breaking the mold here, and that's going to be bones that are looking weird. Things like our vertebrae, our sacrum, coccyx, which is all part of the spine, and our maxilla, so we're talking about our jaw. And then we've got our long bones, and this is going to be bones that are long. So things like our femur, which should be the longest bone in the human body, and then the other bones of the extremity. So it's going to be from those growth plates where we're going to have new bone cells are produced and that are going to allow for the lengthening. Now, these are going to close when we get into late adolescence and early adulthood, but this is obviously pretty variable based upon who we're working with. Now, how many of you guys were essentially full grown? You're as tall now as you were when you were, we'll say 12 years old. Was anybody completely fully grown by the time they were 12? Nice. Anybody else? Okay, how about 13? Yeah. When you were essentially, you got to your peak height, the height you're at currently, when you were only 13 years old. That's okay, Catherine. Okay. How many of you guys were fully grown by the time you were 17? Okay. Fascinating. So, for those of you guys that haven't shared yet, what age were you when you finally stopped growing? And this is how I take roll to figure out who's actually here and paying attention. Dang. Interesting. So obviously the point at which that's okay, Haley. The point at which, your bones quit growing turns out is the point at which you hit your peak height. And for those of you guys that hit it later on, what's fascinating is, yeah, your bones have a greater potential to eventually fracture before those plates have effectively fused, and your risk of fracture is even higher whenever you happen to be going through a growth spurt. So when you're working with athletes, you're working with kids in general, you want to be mindful of the fact of it's incredibly stupid to do true maximal lifting with young kids because they're not fully grown. Your risk reward ratio isn't worth it. Now, that's not to say you can't have them lift heavy, but the key is, how about we just work up to heavy sets of 5 with good technique, then worrying about what the true 1RM is. So now, as far as the increasing in circumference, okay, the inner layer of the perosteum is where we're going to have a membrane that we're going to see building concentric layers of new bone on top of the existing ones. Now, these are being done by what I think are some of the worst named bone cells ever. The osteoblasts are the ones that build new bone. The osteoclasts are the ones that are going to be taking away mineralization. The fact that the word blast is involved in the one that actually is building bone always has annoyed me and will never cease to. And I hope that that doesn't confuse you guys as much as it did me back in the day. Now, your bones are going to be able to grow in density and diameter throughout your entire life, but the actual length is going to stop usually between 15 to 25 years old. And for women, it's going to be in that lower end. Guys, it can be obviously into the 20s. Now, each of us has our own genetics. Genetics are going to give us different effects on rate of growth of our body, and then effectively, obviously, that peak height you're going to attain. But it's going to be the stimulus you apply to your body that's going to change that density of your bones as you go through life. So, bone is what's known as anistropic, which means its strength and stiffness is going to depend on the direction of the loading. So, if you're consistently doing some type of work that's loading force throughout your bones, and it's going to be for that movement pattern, you're going to see increases in bone mineral density along those lines. Now, this is really important because this gives us that specificity of that adaptation. So if you really want to increase the bone mineral density of your arms, you need to do some heavy lifting. And you need to have some heavy compressive lifting, maybe some tensile style lifting. That's going to increase that bone mineral density. If you want to get in arm wrestling, so you don't get those spiral fractures, you should probably work on doing some high rotational force work. Initially, probably doing more isometrics than eccentrics. So that way you're going to be able to build up that bone mineral density along those lines of force that's going to have to be received. So you're going to be able to increase both your cortical and trabecular bone, so you're less likely to get those fractures. Now, if we happen to have issues with too much stress on our bone growth, we can have issues with effectively a growth plate closing too soon, which can often be an issue because it doesn't happen bilaterally, meaning one leg will now be longer than the other. And what we're going to find is that our bones can grow faster than our muscles can handle, which causes pain. And how many of you guys actually had what's known as growing pains because of your growth spurt or otherwise when you were obviously growing up? Bingo. And so that is going to be where you're literally increasing the length of your bones so quickly that those muscles and tendons can't keep up. So that's why having athletes do a lot of stretching and, once again, not trying to do maximal loading when your tissues are effectively tightening up because of how quickly you happen to be getting taller. So how bones respond to stress is what's known as Wolff's Law, effectively, which is those osteoblasts are constantly building your bone, osteoclasts are constantly breaking them down. So effectively, you tend to hold the same unless we have an increased or decreased amount of stress, which is going to cause one or the other to become even more active. So when you're doing a lot of mechanical stress, you're going to increase the amount of osteoblast activity, which is going to cause you to overall gain bone. Whereas when you're not going through as much mechanical stress, the osteoclasts are going to be more active, which in turn is going to cause you to lose bone mineral density. So how do we decrease our bone mineral density? Don't do much of anything. Just hang out, relax, maybe go out into space, maybe spend a lot of time swimming, lay around. That's so obviously how we're going to increase bone mineral density is going to be the antithesis of this. Do weight-bearing exercise. Spend time dealing with greater amount of forces. So doing things like lifting weights. Be on your feet, be moving around, so you have to deal with gravity. And, try to stay on the planet. So this is just showing you that basic structure of those long bones and how we're going to have our cartilage at the end. We've got that trabecular bone. Now this is when we're looking at the femur, which notice, guys, that femoral neck is made up of mostly just trabecular bone, not a lot of cortical bone, which in turn is going to massively increase our risk of injury. Now, what's also important to understand is inside the shafts of our long bones, notice that we've got our bone marrow. And so this is where we're going to actually have our red blood cell production inside of the body. And what's fascinating is when people have a hip replacement, which is usually replacing the femoral head and neck and then putting essentially a metal spike to seed it through the bone, you're literally going to have a situation where you're going to have a decreased red blood cell production for a little bit because you've literally just lost a decent amount of bone marrow. Now, like anything else, if you do enough stress on your bones, in turn, you are going to hypertrophy them. And what's really fascinating, guys, is it seems like there's a relatively tight correlation between your amount of bone mineral density you have and your total amount of lean body mass, in that your muscles, because they can produce this much force and receive this much force, your bones have to remodel to deal with it. So typically, your athletes that have the greatest amount of muscle mass also have the greatest amount of bone mass. Now, correlation does not necessarily mean causation, but it is an important relationship to understand that A, it exists, and B, it still needs to be further investigated to kind of see if there's a limit, so to speak, that you can only carry a certain amount of lean mass if you only have a certain amount of bone mass. I personally find that really fascinating. So, what's going to cause it to promote bone mineral density? Lifting heavy things. Also, doing a lot of heavy impacts. So you're going to find that long distance runners typically have got greater bone mineral density than cyclists because cyclists don't have those impacts. On top of that, individuals that do a lot of plyometric style sports, a lot of powerful changes of directions, things like basketball and soccer, aside from obviously the collisions you get in football, all of which are going to increase bone mineral density. And then doing things like Olympic lifting, doing things like heavy powerlifting, those are going to in turn help increase bone mineral density. And why do we want to have more bone mineral density in the first place, guys? Why do we want to have more bone mineral density in general? Awesome. Yeah. Aside from bones are harder to break, another thing that unfortunately is going to happen is since our tissues tend to go down as we get older, we can start to risk things like osteoporosis, which is going to be literally weaker bones, which in turn are going to be not just easier to break, but sadly enough, a lot of folks, when they become so you have osteopenia when you're about a good 1 to 2.5 standard deviations below the mean for your age group with bone mineral density. And then once you're 2.5, now you're in osteoporosis. And specifically, you've got type 1, which is going to be, after menopause, where you're just going to have lower bone mineral density, typically, in smaller women. So smaller meaning not really height, but body weight. And then you have then age associated, because our body is constantly adapting to the demands around us. And those that suffer from osteoporosis, because sadly enough, they haven't really given their skeleton a reason to be dense. So, for myself and a number of you guys that obviously like to lift weights, you're constantly giving your body a signal like, these bones need to be strong, because otherwise they're going to break under these loads. Whereas if the hardest thing you do all day is walk, eventually your bones can literally become so brittle that just trying to move quickly is what breaks your own leg. In fact, most people, when they break their hip, it's that femoral neck. It's going to literally have been from trying to catch themselves when they slipped. And just activating those muscles that aggressively and that quickly breaks their own leg, because that bone happens to be that weak and that brittle. So now it's not just about doing the weight bearing and otherwise. Hormones are always going to have a massive component to it. That's why guys typically are not going to have as much issues with osteoporosis, since testosterone actually does help with bone mineralization. But the key is your bones need all of their basic constituents from your nutrition in order to increase their bone mineral density. So as you'd suspect, calcium is a big component. But magnesium is a very important mineral when it comes to sparing calcium, because calcium is also important for muscle contraction, along with vitamin D and vitamin K. You need all 4 of those, along with getting in enough protein, getting enough calories in general, so that you're going to be able to support appropriate bone growth and function. And obviously doing large amounts of drugs, because caffeine is a drug, as is alcohol, it can have negative effects on bone mineral density. And the other issue is, if you're doing a lot of drugs, you're typically not eating as good of a well-balanced diet. The two just tend to be pretty highly related. Now, this can happen in younger individuals, specifically athletes that are suffering from what's known as the female athlete triad. And this is going to be, unfortunately, a horrible combination of disordered eating, amenorrhea, so loss of our normal menstrual cycle, and then osteopenia, osteoporosis. Because these athletes are not eating enough, they're typically exercising excessively. Their body is literally not recovering like it should. So they're first going to start to shut down the reproductive cycle. They can even get into issues with anemia because they just don't have enough red blood cell production, and then issues with osteopenia and osteoporosis. So those of you guys that are in exercise physiology with me, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and we'll finish with it in this class as well, because it is a very important thing for you guys to understand. So, like anything else, how we can help avoid that female athlete triad is making sure that we're paying attention to their athletes, looking for signs of eating disorder, meaning they're avoiding eating with groups. After eating a large meal, they always disappear into the bathroom. Unfortunately, a lot of the patterns that you can try to figure out, wearing baggy clothing so you can't really see their physical size. And obviously, don't do things to jack up people's view of themselves, which is overemphasizing weight. We've got enough social media and other pressures around that are telling people to feel bad about how they are built and how they look. And so we want to make sure we're encouraging not just good nutrition, but also healthy eating patterns, having a good relationship with food. Because a lot of us have issues with our relationships with food, and then understanding how parents talk, how athletes talk to one another, and how coaches talk to athletes are all going to massively influence individuals' risks for this type situation. So I think I've talked about before in this class where or maybe I didn't really talk too much about it, but give me one. Well, actually, I'm gonna make, you guys want to see an awkward picture of me from my youth. And if everybody responds, I'll bring it up, but if people don't, then I'm not. So that's how we see who's actually paying attention to the presentation today. So I'm sure all of you guys know of an athlete or unfortunately been that athlete where your coach has told you that you need to gain weight or you need to lose weight and you're too big. And that is rough because if you don't have a lot of, well, 3 out of, or 5 out of 14 guys is not enough people that it counts as, okay, now we're up to 6. We'll see if you guys keep going. Oh, well, now you're actually going for it. That's 6, 10. Oh, we got 4 more people we haven't heard from. Make that 3 more. Make that 2 more. Make that 1 more. Caitlin, you already voted. I'm not that dumb. I can read. So somebody's AFK, so I am saved for my own self. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay. But in all seriousness, guys, how many of you guys have had that coach that's told you to gain weight or told you to lose weight, told you that, you're too big or otherwise? And one thing to keep in mind when you're working with anybody, guys, is there's 2 very different ends of the spectrums here. We can increase desire to change, and we can increase the ability to change. So when we've told somebody to lose weight, what have we really helped increase? What have we really helped increase? Nope. Have we increased their ability to change or their desire to change? Bingo. So, since thankfully one of you guys didn't vote, which allows me to get out of this, but at some point when we're actually in person, I'll show it to you guys. But effectively, I grew up as a fat kid. My PR body weight was about 238 at about 5'7" as a sophomore in high school. So now, mind you, I grew up like 90s fat, which is sadly enough pretty normal now, but then it sucked. And so, I was really good at getting made fun of, but it really helped calcify my mind and has made me probably, obviously, the friendly person you meet today. So cool, I guess. But like anything else, when someone calls you fat, does that really increase your ability to change or increase your desire to change? And you guys exactly said that as your desire. Like, yeah, I would really like to not be bullied. That would be really great. It's awesome to once a year go run the mile and effectively be the one that's slowing everybody up from going on to the next thing. Like, this is a lot of fun. So when you're working with people, you're working with athletes, yes, you will have athletes that it would be advantageous to their ability to play their sport by losing weight. But you increase desire, but you don't increase the ability to change. So instead of them being like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on, I want you to eat 3 meals a day plus a snack, and I want every single meal to have a vegetable. Something where you're actually giving them an ability to change that's helping them. Because if every single meal, guys, before you could even touch the food you want to eat, you had to eat a whole head of uncooked broccoli. How many calories do you think you're going to be not taking in that day because you don't want to eat that whole head of uncooked broccoli? Yeah. Oh, okay. So Luke's just going to chow down through that broccoli and he's going to go right on to the rest of the food he wanted to eat. I like it. A man who's not deterred by eating vegetables. I like that. I like where you're at. No, man, I eat a head of raw broccoli, no issues. I do that on occasion. So the key is that's helping their ability, or it's like, hey, I just want you to just figure out throughout a given day, not even all the calories. We don't want to focus on calories yet. Let's focus on maybe just increasing their protein intake. Because when you increase protein intake, it tends to give them better feelings of satiety, along with it has a high thermic effect of food. So that can in turn itself decrease the calorie intake without having to really focus on calories. Or we can be like, hey, I want you to just go for a walk every single day for half an hour. Okay. You don't have to go, handcuff yourself to a treadmill and run until it turns into a belt sander on your legs. Instead, it's like, I just want you to move a little bit more and just try to keep your diet pretty much the same. So we're trying to give people things we can do to help improve their performance. And really, we're looking at body composition, which is going to be the better thing. Because if we're just trying to say you need to lose weight, which don't get me wrong, if I wanted to be a long distance runner, I need to lose weight. I am way too big to be a good long distance runner that's not going to get banged up from just the sheer physics of moving a 210-pound frame. But we want to create really good attitudes and behaviors with food, because it turns out you have to eat every single day. And if you're not eating enough, that's where you're going to run yourself into some issues. So now let's think about not just being pardon my language, guys, but being a dick when it comes to being a coach. Okay. What do parents frequently do with kids and their body weight? And I'm not saying, your parents just call you fat, but what do they do instead that can sometimes work against the kids? And for those of you guys that, no offense, why am I saying no offense, that you guys have never experienced this, like this will hopefully be useful for you because you might see these behaviors on occasion. Yeah, food availability, because it turns out when you're a kid, you're at the mercy of your parents cooking, absolutely. But think of it along the lines of behaviors you see from your parents. How many of you guys have got that mom or that dad, yes, bringing up those backhanded comments? Have you thought about maybe eating a little bit less? Have you thought about maybe going on a diet? Have you thought about blah, blah, blah? Yup. You look good, but that would probably look better on you if you're like 5 to 10 pounds lighter. Like, oh yeah, now, yeah, it can be really useful in that you have a family that's physically active together. Absolutely, Jared. So it's not saying that all parents are just trying to ruin their kids, but instead think of it along the lines of what can you be doing that you think is in the best interest of the kid, but is actually working against them. Another good example of this is not even thinking about what's happening to your kid, but how many of you guys have got a parent? Yeah. Oh, trust me, Catherine, there's people that are underweight. I've had a number of them. In fact, if you ever want a great way to really get half the room to hate the other half of the room, I found is I only did this a couple times and I don't do it anymore in my classes for the most part, unless they get to grad school, because at that point they kind of understand life's not fair a little bit better, which is like how many of you guys, no matter how much you've tried, have never been able to gain weight? And I'll usually have, like 4 or 5 students that are, very, small, so to speak, relative to their height, that'll put their hands up. And then those of us that, grow up on the other side of the metabolic equation are just looking at them like. So that's true. But how many of you guys have had that mom or that dad that have chronically been dieting or been yo-yo dieting pretty much your entire life? Like they'll lose the weight, they'll gain the weight, they'll lose the weight, they'll gain the weight. And you see their own relationships with food. And it's, it's hard to not have that obviously rub off a little bit on the kid. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah. I mean, it's something when you see, parents that can never be happy with their own body, how do you expect the kids to be happy with their own body when they see that their entire time? So any other questions? Because obviously I just hopped up on the soapbox. You've got the happy different types of fractures there on the bottom, which you guys can read. I'm not going to insult your intelligence about anything we've covered today of both the lower extremity and the basics of bone. Thank you, Caitlin. So the last thing we're going to go ahead and talk about, and this is something that I brought up yesterday in exercise physiology, which is we have one essential, a number of conditionally essential, and then one completely accessory component on the human body, okay? So if you think of the human body kind of like a spaceship, the two processes you definitely need as far as systems of the body is you need your neurological and your cardiovascular / pulmonary systems. Without those two, you're dead. But you can effectively live and be stuck in position and never move, and you'll be all right. Like, yeah, it's not a high quality of life. So then we have all these non-essential but preferred, like having an immune system so we can go outside and not live in a bubble. Having a musculoskeletal system so we can walk around and move. Having a digestive system so that we can obviously enjoy food and keep our body weight up, but you can feed somebody through IVs. Having an endocrine system so you can have all the other fun things that occur there with regulation of your systems in your body. And then finally having a renal system so we can effectively filter the blood. Now, the one system of the body that's completely accessory, not really needed at all, is the reproductive. You know, my dog, our cats, all of them have been fixed, and they're going to live the rest of their life without ever having kids. They didn't have a choice in the matter. We love them enough that we then remove their gonads. So what does that say about us? I don't want to drill down too much. Instead, think of it along the lines when we're getting into athletes with the female athlete triad. If we're to the point where we've shut down we're amenorrheic, we've shut down normal menses in a female, it's safe to say the reproductive system, we've gotten rid of the non-essential. We've jettisoned that because we don't have enough calories. So now we're into the conditionally essential. And so that's why we're seeing issues with losses of bone mineral density, which also means our immune system probably isn't functioning as well as it could, along with our digestive system, our endocrine, and our renal. And then finally, if we're not careful, we can have literal issues of death from things like a heart attack because we're not giving enough energy to our cardiovascular system like we need. So, apologize for going over, guys. You be safe out there. You guys have a great day, and I will see you guys again on Thursday morning. Bye-bye.